So I would like to thank Christos Stergiou and Panos Lekas and the two clubs for bringing all these great colleagues of mine and from all around the world to discuss some topical issues. So I would like to jumpstart this session by discussing about some of the issues that already have been mentioned during the discussions about the role of institutions. And my claim is that to understand the European crisis, not the Greek crisis per se, but also more generally the crisis in the European periphery, we need to dig a bit deeper and to understand not only issues related to the banking system, also to debt restructuring, but also issues about institutions. So if I was to give you the abstract, and since I know that it's already getting late, in a nutshell, the best way to make your dreams come true is to wake up. So, it's Muhammad Ali saying that, and, the guy was waking up every morning to practice. So I think we have to realize as a society that growth will come from entrepreneurship, from innovation, so people have to get up and start working. And to go to my favorite movie, Casablanca, we have to realize that in the long run, the fundamental things apply as time goes by. So what are the fundamental things? As a researcher on growth and development, it seems that one of the underlying fundamental causes of development has to do with institutions. And what exactly is institutions? Doug North, a Nobel laureate in economics, famously coined institutions as the rules of the game. So we had a discussion about entrepreneurship, entrepreneurs, firms, both new ventures and old established firms. They need to know the rules of the game. The rules of the game have to do with the protection of private property. They have to deal about the checks and balances, about how quick and efficient courts are in dealing with disputes, corporate governance mechanisms, red tape. So I want to bring your attention to those issues, which I think are at the core to understand the Greek pathologies. So this is the structure of my remarks, but let me jump to the discussion. So for the past something like 6 years, let's not forget that the Greek economy is in a recession starting in 2008. We have been discussing a lot about debt issues. Debt overhang, debt restructuring. Everybody in the room has become an expert on debt sustainability analysis. Even in lifestyle shows that I monitor in Greece, there will be like some debt sustainability analysis. We will be discussing a lot about banking system issues, NPLs, regulation. Everybody seems to be an expert on what Keynes had in mind when he was writing during the Great Depression. Everybody is now an expert on budget deficit. These are the issues that we have been discussing to a very great extent. So this is a discussion, if you like, of policymakers. Well, this reading and actually these discussions come, actually the underlying cause is that for the Greek crisis there have been 2.5, if I was to say, incomplete readings of the crisis. The first one, which let me call it as the disciplinary punitive, perhaps it stems from some thinkers in Northern Europe, is that, Greece had its party time, and sometime, 2007, 2009, it was hangover time. It was, time that, we stopped going out, had to reflect and sit back and, reflect what we did. The left, quote unquote, actually during the crisis stressed a lot the fact that fiscal policy was contractionary, while if you believe the Keynesian ideas, it would have been exactly the other way around. Both of these approaches actually to some extent are true, but they are inherently incomplete. Because if one is to stare at the data, and this is what I'm doing for a living, it seems that at the core of the Greek crisis is the massive competitiveness loss that my colleague Michael Jacobidis shortly discussed earlier on. The biggest manifestation of that is the humongous trade deficit, or the current account deficit, if you prefer, of the Greek economy before the crisis. Well, in policy debates in Frankfurt, in London, in Athens, people were discussing about those issues among policy circles. When we go to the street, and actually there was some debate even earlier on along this room, there was a lot of a blame game. Perhaps it was the blame of the Troika, it was the blame of the government, the media, the unions, the banks. Everybody engaged in a massive polemic and blame game. I believe that we have to connect the debate on the streets of Athens, which is mostly about the blame game, and the discussions among policy circles in Brussels, Frankfurt, and London, which about like those, if you like, and this comes from an economist, a bit boring issues related to debt and banking and fiscal policy issues. So let me tell you how I view the world. And I'm an academic, so I tend to view the world a bit from the ivory tower. This is what my wife actually keeps accusing me of being very academic. So from a very academic standpoint, The Greek crisis actually has origins which are external. Lehman Brothers collapse, reassessment of global risk appetite. There are some external issues which related to the EU financial and institutional structure, which if we have time, perhaps I will discuss during the discussion. And then if we look at the Greek issues, there are what economists are calling short-run or business cycle-related issues related to monetary policy or fiscal policy that should matter in the short run. But there are some deeper issues, or what macroeconomists like me call the fundamental or the more structural issues. And it seems that we have been discussing a lot about short-run issues related to private investment in infrastructure, government investment that has been collapsing, but actually we need to understand a bit more those features that affect what economists call as total factor productivity, which in some sense reflects how good we are in producing things. Because at the end, growth will come because some people in the room will be better versus some competitors in Belgium or Ireland or Italy in producing goods that I want to buy in London or my friends want to buy in New York City. So just a very quick primer on total factor productivity. It seems that it's related to the stuff that Steve mentioned earlier, entry and exit of firms, creative destruction, if you like the Schumpeterian fancy word, entrepreneurship, research, knowledge generation. And interestingly, if one was to decompose economic development across the world, it seems that this is where the action is. If we want to understand why the US income per capita is something like 50 or 60 times larger than in some African countries, or 5 or 6 times larger than it is in Latin America, we really need to understand why Americans do IT better, for example. Why there is so much creative destruction in the US and there is not that much in continental Europe. And it seems that this is of high relevance, not only because I'm personally obsessed with total factor productivity or with efficiency, but even if you care about redistribution or how equally spread are the gains in the boom, or how the society suffers in a depression like the one Greece has experienced in the past 8 years. So if I was to summarize my thesis in just one slide, it will be this one. So this is a simple scatter plot of income per capita, so a measure of how rich and wealthy societies are on the vertical axis. And on the horizontal axis is a measure of how good the legal system is in protecting shareholders and creditors from expropriation. So, if you want to put your money in, you need to be aware that, I will not take the money and go to my hometown in Calaveras and, enjoy the quiet life. It seems, and actually, first interesting remark, Greece is an evident outlier. So in some sense, in 2008, Greece was exceptional. Its income was, and living standards of everybody, was way higher from what a very simple linear association would imply between how good we are in protecting investors for doing business and how rich we are. And you can see with the blue squares that Ireland, Italy, Portugal, and Spain were also a bit outliers, although not as striking as Greece. This is another plot, actually, with the same measure of investor protection, focusing in the euro area. In 2008, Greece was offering creditors and especially shareholders very weak protection from tunneling activities, from looting, and if anything, actually, Greece was scoring relatively worse on shareholder protection as compared to creditors' rights, which can give an explanation to what Steve mentioned earlier, why we have so much bank-based finance as compared to venture capital like you have in Silicon Valley. You can focus on legal formalism in court, so this is the picture in 2008, so at the onset of the crisis, to settle a very simple dispute. Actually, in Italy, it was like a notorious slow. In Greece, it was slow, although at the time we were a bit better than Italy. I'll show you the scatters at the end, how we look today. But a common feature is that in all the crisis-hit countries, not only perhaps they had a worse performing banking system, not only perhaps they had like more expansionary fiscal policies in the booming years, but their institutions, they were not as sound as the ones in the core. Third observation that I want to alert, if I can, everybody in the room. The World Bank and various international institutions, such as the World Economic Forum, they have been trying to quantify institutional quality across various dimensions. All of those measures are problematic, so I don't want you to literally, I don't want to take an oath for those measures. But they all point out that in the booming years, so from 2000 or from 1999, if you like, till 2007, this is a period where Spain is booming, Portugal is booming, this country is booming. Actually, legal institutions have been slightly deteriorating. Control of corruption, if you like, checks on graft have been deteriorating. And although these measures are typically being accused of reflecting development, actually there were some worrisome signs in the sense that income was growing, but the institutional capacity of the countries was deteriorating. Now, one could say why this is that relevant for an economics meeting as the one that we're having today. Because it matches total factor productivity, which is a measure of total factor productivity is what you see here. You see the Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain since the mid-90s, and especially after the introduction of the euro. Those countries actually, as Michael mentioned, switched to domestic sectors, so like construction, real estate. They try to service the Greeks, the Portuguese firm, the Portuguese, the Spanish firms, the Spaniards. And we have seen less and less, globally competitive Greek firms, with some exceptions, but less and less so. This is another measure of productivity. Again, Germany experiencing considerable productivity gains, so this is like a measure of price inflation, while the countries of the periphery actually losing competitiveness. And so in some sense, what we observe in institutions, we observe in total factor productivity, in price inflation, actually in wage inflation, the picture will be the same. And at the onset of the crisis, we are faced with European imbalances. So at the time, and if I was to be critical of my profession, economics, the world, at least in academia and policymakers, worried a lot about global imbalances. The countries in Asia were saving a lot. Also, commodity-producing countries were saving a lot because of the commodity supercycle, and the US was running a massive current account trade deficit. So at the time, people were talking a lot about those global imbalances. We missed that there were similar European-wide imbalances. Massive trade deficits in the South, Greece included, and at the same time, massive surpluses, which was the mirror icon of that, in Germany, in the Netherlands, and the countries of the core. So, in a nutshell, we have growing total factor productivity or efficiency, if you like, gaps, which are masked by divergent institutions. And then we have the era of the memoranda. So in Greece, we have had 3 memoranda so far. And I think it is fair to say that institutional reform, so issues regarding the court system, product market regulation, public administration, they were of second, if at best, relevance. In the beginning, both the Greek governments and the Troika were obsessed with narrowing the ballooning fiscal deficit, which true, was humongous in 2008 and 2009. So all the efforts were put on taxes, cutting government expenditure, dealing with debt, although in a typical European way, procrastinating, and delaying as much as you can. Then the focus switched to banks, which was the natural outcome after the debt restructuring, because the banks were hit massively by the PSI. And we started discussing about institutional reform very late. So there have been some institutional reform in Greece over the past 6 years. I think it's going to be fair that, Greek governments tried to implement some measures, but I think it's at the same time also fair to say that this institutional reform was not like a massive success. It's a massive success for Greece that in a period of a massive economic downturn, they have managed to close the fiscal deficit, but on the institution side, I'm afraid that we have not done that much. And let me stress that, in the long run, the fundamental things will apply. It's good that we close the fiscal deficit, but in the end, this is what it matters. Perhaps we discuss mostly after what were the underlying reasons for the failure of those reforms. Short policy horizon, so the various governments were having an extremely short period, lack of expertise, clearly lack of vision, lack of ownership, so subsequent Greek administrations were saying, oh, the Troika is telling us to open up, the profession for notaries or pharmacists. So there was no ownership at all for the reforms. The insiders, at least in some sectors, appear to be actually quite powerful, and I think that Nikos Vetas will discuss a bit about that. Reforms coincided with austerity because the timing was wrong. So if you talk to an average Greek today, let's reform and let's open closed profession, immediately they think that this is a way to tax them more. So actually, I think that using the word reform now has a very negative connotation for the average Greek. At the same time, although this is not necessarily my focus, there were massive mistakes from the Troika, and the Troika, I mean, the three institutions that were involved in the process. And actually, the EU, as I was writing a piece with Lucrezia and Richard last year, roughly speaking at that time, we argued at the time to the EU to stop extend and pretend. It seems that we're like 1 year afterwards, and perhaps Richard and Lucrezia, we need to rewrite this article by just changing 2015 to 2016. So the current situation, actually with the third MOU, at least so far it seems cuts, taxes, and let's even have an automatic destabilizer in the sense that if we do not meet the fiscal targets, then we will be forced to tax more or cut government expenditure more. If anything, policy initiatives, for example, in education, are regressive rather than progressive. And still the European Union, my understanding is because of inappropriate or not particularly good timing in Germany, is again to extend and pretend. So where are we left? Nowadays, as we speak, the institutional gap across the Eurozone between the core and the periphery, if anything, has widened. So these are the inefficiencies in courts. So recall that in 2008, it used to take a bit less than 1,000 days to resolve a simple dispute in courts. Today, something like close to 1,300 days. Italy has also gone worse and worse, and I think this is quite relevant because it touches crucially to the discussion that we had on banks. Banks, if they are able to solve the non-performing loans and not enable the zombie firms to restructure, it's vital that they have a nudge from the legal system, which actually today it acts mostly as an impediment, and if anything, rewards those people who loot the firms on their behalf and they engage in misappropriation of funds. So this is a measure, for example, so Richard, I think, asked Governor Sturnaras, how much can we expect to get from the NPLs? If you trust the World Bank statistics, around 30%. So this is the typical recovery rate in Greek bankruptcy, at least according to World Bank statistics. So today, and let me just show that and bring perhaps the more general issue, in Europe, we have the countries of the core where, you can enforce a court. The German and the Dutch governments, I'm not saying that corruption is absent in those countries, but they have checks and balances to monitor those issues. But in the countries of the periphery, these checks and balances that we consider as given in a Western type of civilization, actually they're not present. And if anything, the former transition countries like Poland, the Czech Republic, they look much more similar to the European periphery as compared to the European core. You can look at court delays, many measures, they will point out to the same picture. So how do we move forward? Thankfully, I'm not the politician in the family. So I don't have to come up with very concrete details, but I want to stress, and there was a question, that in a forthcoming book by MIT Press that Nikos Vetas, Dimitri Vagiannos, and Chris Pisaridis are co-editing, with my colleague Stavroula Karadza, we have a chapter on the Greek judicial system, and there we discuss in something like 40 pages, very concrete proposals regarding the justice system. And I know that many other colleagues, Nikos Vetas for Education, will come up with very concrete policy recommendations. At some crowd level, I think that we need reforms both at the national level, and here Greece, because it has symptoms of a failed state, we need the assistance from the European Union, the World Bank, and international institutions. And we need consensus from the society, but also, as a teaser to our foreign distinguished guests, perhaps we need also some institutional form of union at the European Union level. Perhaps, we have to move from a single market to a common single currency area to a banking union, but perhaps something else is missing related to institutions. Thank you very much.